What's up everybody, Reese and Ellie here from R&G Reptiles. We hope you've had a fantastic week, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. If not, then welcome back.
We're gonna
In today's video, we're going to be talking about when you lose one of your animals, what that feels like, what you do about it, and unfortunately that is something which has happened to us just this past week. So let's dive in. So, the event, so to speak, of losing a snake is something that has happened to us 3 times since we started keeping snakes 10 years ago. The first snake that ever escaped, we were fortunate enough to eventually find, and that snake was this guy, Simon. So, bit of backstory. Not sure if any of you watching are familiar with the geography in England, but England is pretty small, to be honest. I was born and raised in the north of England, and after I left university I ended up moving to somewhere in the south of England called Bath. Anyway, when we relocated, my wife and I, back to the northeast from Bath, we had Simon at the time, and I made the foolish mistake of attempting to transport Simon back to the northeast of England with us in his normal vivarium. Now at the time he wasn't quite as large as he is now, and we were homing him. If I can just wrangle him a little bit here. Thank you, Simon. So we were homing Simon in this exact viv right here. Now, this viv doesn't actually have a locking mechanism on it. It has glass sliding front doors. And it was absolutely stupid of me, but I thought that it would be okay to transport Simon in this very viv in the back of our car. What I didn't expect, which I ought to have, is that the vibrations of the car through driving, and bearing in mind that it was about a 5-hour drive from Bath to the northeast where we now live, the vibrations of the car kind of shimmied the front door of the vivarium open, and when we were going 70 miles an hour up a motorway, Simon just appeared between my legs and flopped over on my lap and ended up continuing on over the centre console into the back seats of the car. So he must have gone under the chair and then kind of gone up and over me. Now, my wife and I were not expecting this, so we practically pooed our pants going 70 miles an hour up a motorway, managed to slam the hazards on and pull over onto the hard shoulder. However, by the time we managed to do that, Simon had made his getaway. He'd managed to escape back into somewhere in the car, and we made the decision, thinking that the car was an enclosed space, to continue on our journey, and in theory, once we arrived at our final destination, we thought that if we very, very slowly, methodically unpacked the car and all of the contents of what we were moving, we thought we would be able to eventually find him. And we ended up arriving at our final destination and Simon being absolutely nowhere in sight. So at that point I was just devastated. I truly believed that Simon must have escaped at some point on the car journey, and he would have gotten onto the road and just been killed, and that was it, gone forever. My wife Gabby tried to be optimistic, so she convinced me to leave a mouse in the footwell of the vehicle, thinking, well, if Simon is in here, then he might be lured out by the mouse. So if the mouse disappears, we know he's still in the car somewhere. Alas, a week went by, regularly putting fresh mice into the car, nothing. And the car was regularly in use as well, so my wife was doing kind of school runs during this 1 week period. And after a week passed, we ended up having to do one final journey down to Bath and back again to pick up the last of our belongings. So on Friday after work, it was pretty late, we ended up doing a 5-hour journey back to Bath with a view of coming back to Durham the next day. And on the exact same motorway at about 10 o'clock at night, the car was pitch black, couldn't see a thing, and it happened to be August, so it was relatively warm for British standards of weather, and I was wearing shorts, and I felt something on my knee, and I said to Gabby as calm as I could, Gabby, don't be alarmed, but I think I might have found Simon. So, one hand on the steering wheel, I reached up, turned the lights on inside the car, and there was Simon sticking jet out 90 degrees from my steering wheel, with the second half of his body being inside the steering column of the car. And the poor guy was freezing cold. I mean, he was probably thinking that the car was his new home, and all of a sudden it had been vibrating for hours. So, with a bit of difficulty and struggle, again, pulled over onto the hard shoulder, managed to wrestle him out of the steering column of the car, and we ended up wrapping him up in a hoodie and then putting him in a bag, and my wife just held on to the bag for the rest of the journey. And ironically, one of the final belongings that we were travelling down to collect in the first place was a travel viv. So when we ended up getting back down to our old home in Bath, we had a vivarium that we could safely, securely keep Simon and then transport him back to the northeast in as part of the return journey the next day. So, bit of an adventure with that first escape, and we were extremely lucky to actually find him again and be able to actually bring him home. So, the second snake in our collection that we unfortunately had escape, we regrettably weren't able to find. And that second snake was a Amel corn snake, which we named Silas. Now, Silas we purchased about 5 years ago, and he escaped after we had him for about a year, so he escaped about 4 years ago. To this day, my wife and I are unsure how he managed to escape his enclosure. The enclosure that we were keeping him in was one of the. In fact, hang on, I'm just gonna put Simon back because he's just trying to get away from me. So, the enclosure that we were keeping Silas in, it wasn't this exact enclosure, but it was this exact type. So the same kind of locking mechanism on the lid, where it's fairly escape proof. You can only really open the cage if you have opposable thumbs. So to this day, my wife and I are unsure of how Silas managed to escape, and when we realised he had escaped, the time between us last seeing him and noticing that he wasn't in his enclosure was about 24 to 48 hours. Now, when we noticed, immediately we just emptied the surrounding rooms of all belongings, furniture, emptied drawers, cupboards. We looked everywhere and unfortunately couldn't find him. Following that, we put snake hides dotted around the room against the walls, and we also spread flour on the floor, basically throughout the entire downstairs of our home. The theory being that if Silas was to go through any of the areas that had flour, we would be able to see his movements. And with the hides, the theory being that if he came across them, he would be more inclined to hide in a snake hide than he would be in, say, a larger drawer or something of that ilk. But, as I say, regrettably, we weren't able to find him, and after such a long amount of time has passed, it's unlikely that we ever will, unfortunately. So that was a big loss. And yeah, unfortunately, that's all that can be said about Silas. So, the third and final snake that did escape our collection, you'll be pleased to know, was found, and that is this girl, Sivia. Sivia being our pastel leopard het desert ghost female. And what a beauty is she. She's just an absolute stunner. Now, the story behind Sivia's escape is that she's been off food for a few weeks, and last feeding day, she rejected the food the first time we offered her. And knowing that we would want to give her a second attempt at feeding, I failed to lock her enclosure. So I did close it, but not all the way, it seems, and I certainly didn't lock it. And what ended up happening is that we ended up not giving her a second chance at the meal. And after we had fed the rest of the collection, we just cleaned up and went to bed. And Sivia seized the opportunity, she seized the moment, and took to the wind. So it wasn't until literally 24 hours later I returned from work. I walked into our living room, and Sivia's tank is literally this one that I'm pointing to now, so bottom far corner, and I looked over at her tank and noticed the glass was just cracked like that much. And immediately I started to panic, so I went over to the tank and opened it up fully and emptied the contents completely, and Sivia was nowhere to be seen. So, as you can probably imagine, the curse words were flowing, and I immediately shouted for my wife. I emptied all of the shelves and drawers that we have down here, in case she had slipped down into them coming out of the vivarium, and they were clear. My wife walked into the living room a minute later, and she suggested that we look under the furniture. So my wife actually lifted one side of the sofa, and lo and behold, Sivia was there, curled up, true to the name of ball pythons, smack dab in the centre of the underneath of our sofa. Now, not knowing what kind of mood she was going to be in, I was very, very kind of tentative to just reach in and grab her in case she struck. And the reality is, even if she did strike, it would hardly hurt, if it hurt at all. But I ended up touching her. She was freezing cold. Oh, sorry, technical issues there. So, I reached under the sofa and grabbed her. She was freezing cold. So, the sofa on the far side of the room is next to a set of trifocal doors. and yeah, she was clearly feeling the temperature. Kind of outside temperatures currently where we live are around about 4 or 5 degrees C. She's giving me a little squeeze right now. Anyway, so not wanting to give her any kind of temperature shock, I put her in the cool side of her enclosure, so the ambient temperature would have been just a few degrees C warmer than the room temperature that she was, just under the sofa. And I do think that she was probably a little bit stunned at having been suddenly manhandled from underneath the sofa, this completely foreign land for her. And she's been fine. So it's been about 1 week since that incident now, and she seems to have settled in fine, back to her usual self anyway. You can see she's a bit curious, but honestly, when I saw that open viv, my heart dropped. And I think something really important to remember when a snake does escape is that they are going to look for somewhere to hide. They're not going to run for the hills. They're not going to try and get very far. They're going to look for the closest, smallest, darkest space that they can find, typically. Now, obviously, as you've heard, our Simon was a little bit different. He decided to go base jumping onto my lap in the middle of the car. But certainly when it comes to royal pythons, they are just going to want to find the smallest, darkest space that they can. And true to that, or testament to that, is we found Sylvia less than 2 feet from her enclosure under that sofa. So there you have it. That's the story of the 3 escape artists that we have had to contend with over the years. And hopefully we'll have little or nothing similar to it again. So each time that this has happened, we've tried to take lessons from the experience and make sure that our animals are as safe and secure as they can possibly be. So I'm just going to put this little girl back in her home now. Alright, well that's it from us for this week at RNG Reptiles. I really hope that you enjoyed the video this week, and if you have snakes of your own, hopefully you can potentially kind of learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past, and not have to suffer the same kind of experiences yourself. But thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please comment down below, or if you have anything that you would particularly like to see, any content ideas, let us know as well, and we'll absolutely do everything we can to make that happen. We try and put a video out every Sunday, so please tune back in next week. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that thumbs up like button before you go. So once again, that's it for me. See you next time. Goodbye.